I don't want to set the world
To understand communism, its basic godless philosophy, its goal of world conquest, its insidious tactic, and its cunning strategy, the communist fifth columnist.
Your future may not be as secure as you think. Where will you be when the atomic bombs fall?
Red China's battle plan. Divide and encircle. Conquer and enslave.
You can secure your family's future by reserving a spot in a state-of-the-art underground vault from Vault-Tec. That's right, Bob. Act now, and your family...
Aggression has incited rebellion against the established government.
Big one.
Your business in Shady Sands might be...
Do you join the Unity, or do you die here?
Most folks call it NCR now.
We humans will take back that which is rightfully ours.
A paladin always has a say where the Codex is concerned.
Our primary goal is the free exchange of ideas.
Thesis and antithesis. The conflict is inevitable.
NCR may have its problems, but when we're riled, watch out.
If you want to see the fate of democracies, look out the windows.
Fallout is a series of post-apocalyptic computer role-playing games set in a retro-punk environment, which are focused on open-world exploration, survival, and character building. The original was created by Enterplay Entertainment in 1997, and the series has been expanded on with additional titles by different developers over the years. The Fallout series takes place in 22nd century society, where nuclear war has devastated the world, and most of the survivors are the people who made it to the Fallout shelters in time. Once they emerge from these vaults, they form radically diverse factions who try to survive and thrive in a new wasteland. Most of the stories in Fallout are based on those factions and the conflicts that go on between them. Fallout was heavily inspired by 1970s novel and movie Boy and His Dog. The story was also set in a post-nuclear war, which followed a boy and his telepathic dog companion. The pair formed an unlikely companionship, scavenging for food and other supplies in the wasteland. They relied on each other to survive, with a boy using firearms to protect his dog, and a dog providing tactical oversights with his superior senses to protect the boy. The protagonist would eventually come across an underground Fallout shelter and discovers that the society in the vault to be much more dangerous and deranged than the wasteland above it. Both the Fallout world and the many factions in it are based on our own real-world history and cultures. Fallout's history only starts to diverge after World War II, with minor alterations to our Cold War history, which would ultimately lead to its cataclysmic nuclear war. It also depicts an accurate and functional post-apocalyptic economy in which both the player and the factions take part in. As players discover the many different ideas and beliefs of the factions, they are forced to make ethical decisions that shape their stories and the fate of their related factions. The lore of Fallout is so deep and distinctive that discussions involving their themes, cultural relevancy, and morality are still being discussed in gaming circles years after its release. What are the historic events of Fallout that led to its nuclear war? How accurate is the functional post-apocalyptic economy of the Fallout series? And what can we learn from the many factions of the Fallout universe? This is Love, Life and Anarchy, and I'll be answering these questions as we explore the philosophy of Fallout.
In the 21st century, war was still waged over the resources that could be acquired. Everyone was optimistic. But as the hostilities escalated, optimism faded.
The destructive nature of man could sustain itself no longer. The world was plunged into an abyss of nuclear fire.
When atomic fire consumed the Earth, those who survived did so in great underground vaults.
One's future in the wasteland is never certain, for an old power has awakened. War. War never changes.
Fallout's historic events that led to their nuclear war are based on our own modern history. The timelines only start to diverge after World War II, with minor alterations to our own Cold War history and the invention of the semiconductor transistor. At the end of the Second World War in 1945, the only two superpowers standing in a war-torn world was the United States of America and the Russian Soviet Union. The United States and its NATO allied countries represented nationalism, capitalism, and individual freedoms, while the Soviet Union represented communism, central economic planning, and Marxist rule. Both of these ideologies were antitheses of each other, resulting in political and military tensions between the Eastern Bloc and capitalist bloc. The two superpowers feared that their differing ideologies would infiltrate into each other's societies, creating significant economic, political, and military conflicts, which could eventually escalate to an all-out nuclear war. This constant state of animosity between these two superpowers was known as the Cold War. Many proxy wars were encouraged and funded by these two superpowers, which were fought in contested states such as Greece, China, Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. To add to the tension, thousands of nuclear weapons were being manufactured by both superpowers in a nuclear arm race, competing for supremacy in nuclear warfare. Because these two superpowers were able to destroy each other, neither superpower had the incentive to initiate a nuclear war. This military doctrine was known as the Mutually Assured Destruction Policy, and was the only deterrence against atomic warfare. The possibility of nuclear annihilation was a constant fear among people during the Cold War. There were educational videos relating to nuclear dangers. Fallout shelters were built across Europe and America, and safety procedures, such as duck and cover, were taught to children in government schools. One of the few positive benefits of the Cold War was the competitive space race between the two superpowers for dominance in spaceflight capability. It led to the creation of the first artificial satellite, the launch of the first unmanned space probe, and the first successful landing of man on the moon. The space race was another outlet used to demonstrate the superpowers' technological superiority over each other, and was seen as necessary projects for national security. In our world, the Cold War only ended once the Soviet Union collapsed. The totalitarian nature of the socialist state brought economic hardships and cultural suppressions onto their satellite states, eventually resulting in nationalistic revolutions in many Soviet republics, including Poland, Bulgaria, and Germany. Russia would soon follow, dissolving their own socialist system that they created and replacing their Soviet flag with the pre-revolutionary Russian flag. While most of Europe disbanded their socialist ideals, China still held on to theirs, referring to itself as a communist republic. However, in the Fallout universe, these events didn't happen. The Soviet Union and China continued to be strong communist powers, furthering the tensions between NATO and the Eastern Bloc. The Cold War was prolonged, resulting in many more proxy wars across the world. The nuclear arms race was also escalated, producing more atomic armaments across both powers. The possibility of nuclear war was amplified, with no foreseeable end to the Cold War in sight. The second major point of Fallout's Divergence is that the transistor was not invented until much later in its history. Before the transistor, vacuum tubes were used to control electric current through a process called thermonic emission. By heating the cathode metal in the vacuum tube, electrons gained enough energy to jump a short distance once they reached a high enough temperature, resulting in a thermionic emission. This process was needed to operate complex electronic devices such as televisions, radios, and older computers. The vacuum tube was eventually replaced by the transistor to control electric currents in electronics. Instead of using heat, the transistor would use semiconductor materials to control the flow of electrons without the need of heat. This is done by adding impurities to the semiconductor, which can change its properties from being a conductor to an insulator, controlling the electrical current. Semiconductors are considered to be a superior way of managing the flow of electricity compared to thermonic emissions, and replace the obsolete vacuum tubes in electronics. Transistors are the key active component in practically all modern electronics. Because they are cheaper, smaller, and more reliable than the vacuum tube component, it revolutionized the electronic industry. It advanced society from the atomic age, into the jet age, into the space age, into the now current digital age. In our world, the transistor was invented by two independent teams in the 1950s, while in the Fallout universe, their transistor was not invented until much later in their timeline. Their reliance on vacuum tubes meant the technology followed an inferior path, staying in an atomic age for a prolonged period of time. While our electronic devices became smaller and lighter, their electronic devices that relied on vacuum tubes became larger and heavier. The increased energy requirements needed for transporting and developing these cumbersome technologies put additional strain on the global energy requirements, leading to a high demand of fossil fuels. To ease these energy demands, atomic power was normalized, and nuclear technology was implemented throughout the world with the use of fission reactors. The mainstream use of nuclear power done alongside the Cold War resulted in an exaggerated space race, which saw many technological advances in society, including the birth of artificial intelligence, atomic-powered cars, high-powered direct energy weapons, and battle armor which was used in military affairs. The aesthetics of such technologies create a specific stylized form of design known as atom punk, a derivative of cyberpunk that is found all throughout the Fallout universe. Vacuum tubes and the Cold War continued on for decades in the Fallout world, stagnating their technology and their culture, while raising military tensions and energy requirements. Soon, the petroleum that was used for oil, as well as the uranium that was used for atomic power, was in short supply and became increasingly valuable. Rather than trade for these precious resources, militarized nations would often invade and annex other nations for their reserves, creating a series of global conflicts known as the Resource Wars. The European Commonwealth would invade the Middle East in response to the rising oil prices. The United Nations would disband and collapse after heated debates over national policies and resource allocations. Israel's largest city, Tel Aviv, would be destroyed in a nuclear terrorist attack, starting a limited nuclear weapon exchange in the Middle East. The People's Republic of China would invade Alaska for their oil. America would annex Canada for theirs. Experimental biological drugs were developed by American defense contractor Westech, designed to genetically enhance United States soldiers and give them an advantage in the resource wars. America invaded China's mainland in the height of the Sino-American War with their power armor technology, and was able to defeat Chinese forces in their homeland without much effort, capturing the cities Shanghai and Nanjing. In desperation, China would launch their nuclear weapons against the United States in retaliation of their invasion, triggering the Mutually Assured Destruction Pact. Most nations launched the nuclear weapons they had manufactured throughout the Cold War era in a panic, bringing about an all-out nuclear war. This event is referenced as the Great War in the Fallout universe. While it only lasted for 2 hours, it destroyed over 2,000 years of accumulative human civilization. The result had a devastating effect on the world, with the mass extinction of animals, the destruction of the environment, the significant reshaping of Earth's geography, and the deaths of the majority people of the world. The Great War wiped the slate clean on Earth, creating a new cultural, economic, and political reality for generations to come. For the survivors of the Great War, the time period before the war is summarized as the pre-war period, and the time period after it is referred to as the post-war period. This event would forever be remembered as the most devastating man-made catastrophe of Earth's history that could have been completely avoided. Leaders, intellectuals, and philosophers would use the harsh lessons of the Great War to form new ideological movements, attempting to find meaning in the disaster and try to move forward in a positive direction. Some people blamed human greed. Others blamed governments and democracy, while others blamed technology. New religions were also founded from the event, including the Children of the Atom, as well as the Children of the Cathedral, while others kept the same faith from the more traditional religions. In the Fallout universe, the majority of Earth's population was either killed by the initial firestorms, or from radiation poisoning found in residue fallout and black rain. Most of the people who survived the Great War intact were the ones who made it to the fallout shelters in time. These fallout shelters were part of the Project Safe House campaign, a government-commissioned project that was designed to shelter Americans and keep them protected in the event of nuclear war. They were built to be safe, secure, and self-sufficient from the outside world, with enough provisions to keep their inhabitants alive for a long time. Although that was Project Safe House official marketing story, the ulterior motive of these shelters was to run various tests on an unaware population. The purpose of these tests was to better understand the effects of isolation, stress, drugs, radiation, and various technologies on unsuspecting people. The data would be used to further the interests of the government in case the resource wars left Earth too devastated to be inhabitable. Some votes tested the effects of frequent psychoactive drug use. Others ran the dwellers through extended use of virtual reality simulations. And others, such as Vote 111, tested the effects of prolonged cryogenics. These kinds of government experiments are not isolated to the Fallout universe. Various governments around the world, including Japan, North Korea, China, and the United States, have a history of performing disturbing experiments on human populations. These include chemical testing on prisoners, experimental vivisections, injecting soldiers with Agent Orange, releasing fallout in the atmosphere of small towns, feeding radioactive material to disabled children, and many more that are publicly documented. There's no reason to assume that these secret experiments don't continue on to this day. The social experiments of these vaults sometimes lasted for generations, affecting the culture and the moral beliefs of the dwellers inside. Generations of families were born into these vaults, unaware of what was outside, ignorant of their world history, and with little understanding of ethics or morality. The first vaults opened 10 years after the Great War. Others didn't open until 200 years later. The people who eventually left these vaults formed communities and factions that were based on the cultures of the vault, or the cultures of their environment that they found themselves in. When Vault 15 opened, for example, the overcrowded and radically diverse culture groups would create 4 separate factions which were based on the cultures of the vault and the cultures of the old world. The challenges the factions faced in the new world were significant. People needed to be sheltered, clothed, fed, and hydrated in the post-apocalyptic environment. There were many dangerous mutated animals in the wilderness that were aggressive, and other vault dwellers and factions were not necessarily friendly or open to relations. Energy sources, such as oil and uranium, had mostly been consumed in the resource wars, making the numerous automobiles and trucks that were scattered throughout the wastelands useless. Supermarkets, factories, farming industries, and trade routes were also destroyed in the Great War, hammering these industries and infrastructures down to little more than ruins. Various domestic livestock used in agriculture, such as horses, cattle, sheep, and chickens, were either made extinct from the nuclear fallout or were mutated from the radiation and other mutagens, making farming a challenging undertaking, and the specialized knowledge needed to rebuild civilization was lost in the Great War, either through the firestorms that destroyed libraries filled with books, or with the deaths of the experienced people who worked in those fields. The only economic benefit that the Great War brought was that various consumable items were scattered across the wastelands from the blasts, including pre-packaged food, weapons, ammo, and other pre-war technology. With the original owners of these goods gone, these unowned items were available for the taking, and so most people would scavenge pre-war items to get what they needed, as opposed to creating the goods themselves in industries that no longer existed. Agriculture communities was one of the first industries that were established after the first vaults opened. There was plenty of non-perishable foods found in the fallout shelters and in the wasteland. But for long-term sustainability, survivors would eventually need to harvest plants and animals themselves. The only two domestic livestock found in fallout that could aid farmers were the Brahmins, which are mutated cattle, and bighorners, which are mutated sheep. Brahmins were a crucial breed in Fallout, as they were the only animal that could perform the tasks that most farmers needed. Not only were Brahmins one of the few sources of meat, leather, and milk, but domesticated Brahmins was the only source of reliable labor, able to plow fields and transport goods. Bighorners were also a source of meat and leather, but they were not as domesticated as Brahmins, refusing to carry packs or pull plows. Farmers also needed rich soils and clean, non-irradiated water, which made the actual location for agriculture endeavors important, as various areas of the world were differently affected by the Great War. The areas near the nuclear blasts were dangerous and unworkable, whilst other areas were relatively free from radiation and had clean water sources. Vault dwellers that were lucky enough to be issued a Garden of Eden creation kit by Vault-Tec could also use this device to revitalize areas of the post-nuclear wasteland as another solution. Farming and agriculture was needed to create food, water, and other critical materials. But for more complex supplies, scavenging the pre-war world was the only way to get them. In Fallout, most survivors scavenged the resources they needed from the wasteland. These resources could be consumed directly, sold to traders, used in settlements, or if the scavenger had the relevant skills, could be recycled into creating more useful items. The benefits of scavenging in a post-nuclear world is that the amount of unclaimed items in the world is disproportional to the amount of survivors, allowing for a relatively resource-rich economy, considering that there are no means to create them. This economic model of scavenging is not just found in Fallout. It currently employs millions of people worldwide, and is commonly known as waste picking. Most popular in developing countries, waste pickers earn a living collecting, sorting, recycling, and selling unclaimed waste that others have thrown out. It is usually more economically viable to reuse materials that has been discarded than it is to mine or manufacture the same material from the ground. And so the people who need these materials save time and money when they buy them directly from the waste pickers. The greatest limitation of waste picking is that you most likely won't find the specific items that you are looking for. You might find too much of a particular item that you don't want, and too few of an item that you actually need. For example, if you're a doctor, you might salvage a lot of ammo that you don't use, and not enough medicine supplies that you need. But while you might not have what you want, to a marksman, you have the exact thing that they need. If you were to meet an ethical marksman, you could trade your ammo for his medicine supplies, and both be better for it. This is what traders specialize in, and why they are considered to be the backbone of any scavenger economy. Traders are the middleman, buying the items that scavengers do not want, and holding onto them until they can find an interested customer they can sell to. Through traders, scavengers have access to items that they won't find on their own. In these trades, both the scavenger and the trader gain from the exchange. Even though traders mark up the price of their goods for a profit, it is usually worth the price for the convenience. Most successful traders breed and manage Brahmins, which are able to travel great distances and hold large inventories, to increase the likelihood of finding interested customers to trade with. The most established traders invest their profits back into their own business, creating large caravan companies, increase the use of Brahmins, establish trade routes, and hire mercenaries for safety. Without these traders and merchants, scavengers would have to travel and barter themselves, wasting time and resources that could be spent elsewhere. The Crimson Caravan Company and the Water Merchants are the biggest caravan companies found in Fallout, and are instrumental to the success of the wasteland. The economic backbones of these industries would eventually lay the foundations for new nation-states. While traders and scavengers can directly barter items with each other, they'll sometimes not have the specific items that they both want. In these cases, it is preferable to get rid of the unwanted items for something that is more commonly accepted. These commonly accepted items can sometimes take the form of grains, cigarettes, rocks, or more commonly, money. Money serves as the in-between medium of exchange, as it's valuable and commonly accepted among people everywhere. For money to serve its purpose as the medium of exchange, it's preferable for it to have some value, that it cannot be counterfeited, that it is in a fixed supply, and that it can be easily transportable. In Fallout, bottle caps was used as a medium of exchange, as they meet the criteria needed for money. The machines that manufactured these bottle caps were destroyed, so they could not be counterfeited. Bottle caps could be stacked following its design, so they could be easily transported, and they were aesthetically pleasing to the Vault Dwellers, as they represented the glory of pre-war days, so they had some intrinsic value. For these reasons, they were accepted as a legitimate form of money. The detriment of caps is that they were big and bulky in size. Traders who became profitable would have thousands of bottle caps to their name, making it harder and dangerous to transport. Another problem is that expensive items could cost hundreds of bottle caps, making the job of counting caps to be tedious and prone to error. These problems could be solved by traditional banking services. Traditional banks could store your bottle caps in a secure location and give you a representation of those caps as a bank certificate. This paper currency could be easily stored, transportable, and allows for a large amount of caps to trade hands easily. This is how money worked when most of the world was based on a gold standard. Instead of bottle caps, gold and other precious metals was used as a medium of exchange. The benefits of gold are the same as caps. Gold supply was fixed, could not be counterfeited, and central authorities could not manipulate the supply. Banks would provide paper representations of gold as certificates, which are easier to store, transport, and trade than metal. These certificates could be reverted back to gold at any time. In Fallout, caps were backed by water, and so bottle caps could be reverted back to water at any time. But once water purifiers became more accessible in the Fallout world, and clean purified water could be created, bottle caps fell back on its scarcity and its aesthetic qualities for its value. The foundation of Fallout's economy was based on farmers, scavengers, traders, and bottle caps. These elements work together to satisfy individual needs and demands in Fallout. When the people of the wasteland are not shooting each other, they are trading peacefully with each other, to the benefit of everyone who uses this system. While the scavenger and limited farming model can meet short-term demands, it is not a viable long-term solution. As the population increases, resources become scarce, and unclaimed items become harder to find, the waste picker model will need to transition. Factions would eventually need to produce goods on their own, expanding their own agriculture industries until societies transitioned into an industrial-based economy, relying on steam-powered engines or renewable energies to meet their expanding needs. To achieve these goals, societies would need to coordinate their resources efficiently, create new industries, respect each other's property rights, and be secure from the dangers of the wasteland, which very few factions in Fallout are capable of doing. What's worse, disruptive groups of bandits would constantly interfere and endanger the productive people of the wasteland, making it difficult to expand and undertake more challenging projects. This can be seen with the many raider groups of Fallout. Raiders make up a variety of factions that don't usually partake in the production of goods, but steal to get what they needed. Raiders can range from harmless scavengers trying to get by, to crazed psychopaths that spread terror across the wasteland. Harmless scavengers are usually individuals that raid non-occupied locations, such as gas stations, supermarkets, and abandoned towns, stripping them clean of valuable resources. Scrap metal, usable goods, and useful trade items are sought by these scavengers, and are taken back to trade posts or societies that can make use of them. These types of raiders are beneficial to the societies of the wasteland, and are welcomed by towns and traders to help improve their local economies. These scavengers are made up of vault dwellers, families, and other factions that do not seek to harm or interfere with others, and only use violence for self-defense. The more aggressive raiders are individuals who are not interested in working or trading with others, and prefer to take what they wanted through force. They usually form gangs and embrace a nomadic lifestyle, traveling in packs and attacking low-risk targets for any valuable items they can use or sell. Most of these bandits raid in order to survive, and some might have unreliable relations with merchants to trade with. These raiders include the factions of the Powder Gangers, the Yakuza, the Boot Riders, and the Khans. Raiders generate many enemies through this approach, and can be shot on sight by other scavengers once their gangs become notorious. As towns, factions, and technology grows, so do the risks involved in raiding a well-armed and organized population. This is why the more successful raiding factions, such as the Great Khans, transition away from raiding and move into the black market. Manufacturing and trading illegal drugs to larger factions is a much more profitable and safer method of earning resources than raiding. The most terrifying and despised raiders are the bandits that do not raid for economic or survival purposes, but for thrills. Like most other raiders, they target low-risk targets and lone travelers, but unlike the other bandits, they mostly do it for fun. These raiders terrorize the wasteland, partake in the slave trade, experiment with cannibalism, and carry out the worst of sexual abuses, such as rape, genital disfigurements, and pyromanical mutilation. Some of these raiders are the way that they are because of the distressing experiments of the worst Fallout vaults, where their humanity has been stripped down into primal impulses. Others are fueled by psychoactive drugs, such as Psycho, Overdrive, and Jet. Through excessive drug use and the traumatization of the vaults, some of their minds are too far gone. When these groups are left uncontested, they can become powerful enough to control small towns and territories. Chaos and terror is felt among their neighbors, as scavengers, traders, and even their children can be abducted into slavery, be tortured, or even eaten. These raiders include the factions of the 80s, the White Legs, the Jackals, and the Fiends, who are hated and feared by most other factions in the wasteland. These groups usually have large bounties placed on their heads by traders, towns, or other factions, encouraging adventurers to hunt them down for justice and security. Raiders would often target Shady Sands, one of the first and largest urban cities founded after the Great War by Vault 15. It was a completely self-sufficient community, thanks to the terraforming device of the Gek. Mazes and cabbages were grown in abundance. Clean water was taken out of wells, and Brahmin herds were bred and domesticated. Trade routes were established to nearby towns, such as the Hub and Junktown, where merchants and scavengers would meet to trade with each other. These established towns and smaller colonies would typically be open for everyone, as long as you followed their two rules: don't steal and don't start trouble. While security was looked after by local police force or town sheriffs, the trade and caravan routes were less protected and were targeted by raiders who wanted their supplies. Third-party mercenaries were often hired for protection and to deter raiders, but safety could never be guaranteed. Not only were raiders and mutated animals dangerous security risks, but more fearsome and terrifying creatures also stalked the wasteland. New unknown monstrosities attacked caravans and settlements near Shady Sands, and people began to disappear without a trace. These events would form the plot of the original Fallout game, which would establish the ongoing lore for future Fallout releases. The experimental biological drugs that was developed by Westech in the Resource Wars was originally designed to genetically enhance United States soldiers. This mutagen, called the Forced Evolutionary Virus, was a major source of mutation in the Fallout world, and was even more potent than the radiation from the nuclear fallout. And once it was discovered by a small group of survivors, it would be used again to transform the willing and the unwilling into similar mutated super soldiers. These super soldiers, or super mutants, were stronger, smarter, and tougher than the humans it transformed, making them superior in almost every way. They were also immune to the effects of radiation, infectious diseases, and other viral contaminants that were found in the wasteland. The most impressive quality of these super mutants was that their cells could never age, meaning they were biologically immortal. The Forced Evolutionary Virus lay dormant and undiscovered for many years after the Great War until it was found by Dr. Richard Gray. He led an expedition outside of Shady Sands to uncover the causes of the caravan attacks. His team found a deserted military base in Mariposa, which the US government had been occupying during the Resource Wars to mass produce the super soldier virus. In Fallout, Dr. Gray was plunged into a vat by a robotic arm that contained the virus, transforming him into a biomass that was a collection of human flesh, computer parts, and artificial intelligence. He titled himself the Master once his transformation was over. Like many other survivors of the post-war world, Dr. Richard Gray was depressed about the destruction of human civilization from the Great War. But unlike the others who blamed technology or governments, he would blame the differences of people, believing that as long as there was disunity across races, cultures, and identity, there will always be conflict between them. He concluded that it was impossible for humans to ever achieve peace while there was diversity among them. After his transformation into the Master and discovering the beneficial capabilities of the Forced Evolutionary Virus, he planned to forcibly evolve all surviving humans into the remarkable super mutant race, which would remove all inequalities found in individuals and unify them into a single identity. Through this unification, the Master believed that the constant infighting and disunity found in the distinct groups of humanity would disappear, and because super mutants were immortal and held superior qualities to mankind, not only could they survive the many dangers of the wasteland, but they could thrive in it. To help lure people into the vats containing the Forced Evolutionary Virus, the Master established a religious cult to spread his philosophy and to mask his activities, called the Children of the Cathedral. In this religion, the Great War was preached as an inevitable result of human differences, demonstrated through greed, corruption, and selfishness. The Great War, or the Holy Flame, was humanity's chance to begin anew. Through the event that almost destroyed humanity, the Dark God waited in the void below, waiting to lead his beloved children into a new era of peace and unity. Once everyone was reborn into the next stage of evolution, there will be no more war, no more differences, and no more suffering in the new age of peace. But the Forced Evolutionary Virus didn't always work as it was supposed to. Some humans were transformed into abominations, such as floaters and centaurs, and were not part of the Master race. Other mutations were not optimal, creating mutants that had their intelligence regressed and dimmed, leaving behind brutes that were incapable of critical thought. Others were transformed into Nightkins, who were delusional, aggressive, and paranoid, creating disunity in their ranks. Even when mutations were completely successful, super mutants still had free will and would often ideologically disagree with others, creating different factions within the super mutant race. The only unity that was shared among the super mutants was that they all looked up to the Master for leadership, and that their religion encouraged brotherhood. Moreover, while the super mutants were immortal and could not age, the effects of the Forced Evolutionary Virus made them sterile. They would be the first and the last generation of mutants, as they could not reproduce. Once the player proves to the Master that his super mutants could not reproduce and were sterile, the Master was consumed by guilt guilt and remorse over the failure of his plan and the lives he had stolen to conceive it. He either commits suicide in shame or is killed by the player by the end of Fallout 1. Without the vision and the leadership of the Master, the transformed super mutants were spiritually lost and wandered through the wasteland seeking meaning. They would disband from the Children of the Cathedral to create different factions. The brutish super mutants did not have the intelligence needed to form meaningful relationships with others, and would typically attack humans on sight, creating new unwanted dangers in the wasteland. The more intelligent super mutants would try to atone for the past mistakes, seeking to improve their relations with humans so they could trade, survive, and preserve their sterile race from the dangers of the wasteland. These super mutants would come to understand that forcing humanity to evolve was immoral and wrong, as humans had the capability of rising above their inequalities to resolve conflicts peacefully without the need to evolve into something else. Because of the brutish mutants that attacked humans on sight, and that newer generations of super mutants evolved in the East Coast would cause problems to the people that lived there, the super mutants would become a persecuted race. Most human factions did not associate with them, and others have declared them abominations that needed to be purged. The more rational super mutants wanted to get along with humans and live in peace with them, but because they are a persecuted race, that reality is difficult to achieve. Most people do not start trouble with them, however, as they are, after all, a biologically enhanced super race. Super mutants are not the only mutation that humans can go through. Under continual radiation exposure, humans can undergo a different mutation and turn into ghouls. Like super mutants, ghouls developed rapid cell regeneration capabilities and couldn't age. But unlike the super mutants, they lack strength and endurance through severe tissue damage, although they have heightened senses that makes them more perceptive than humans. The exposure to radiation has also made them sterile, making the ghoul generation that have been mutated from the Great War the first and last generation. Because ghouls have long lives and do not age, they often change their names and fulfill many different roles to get by. The deterioration of tissue caused by radiation can also affect their minds. When enough tissue has been rotten by radiation, civil ghouls can become feral, losing their ability to reason or think critically, and become little more than impulsive monsters that stalk in the shadows looking for things to feed on. Because of the primal nature that civil ghouls can regress to, and the savage threat that they pose, most people view ghouls negatively and discriminate against them, using terms like zombie, shuffler, or brain eater to demean them. Similarly, ghouls can hate humans back, which can sometimes grow into an intense bitter hatred, using slurs such as smoothskin or normie in return. The disgusting and decaying nature of ghouls is another reason why they are discriminated against, as they are physically repulsive to most people. This is similar to the Japanese survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who were also disfigured from the nuclear blasts and fallout radiation. Japanese people feared that their radiation poisoning could be contagious or be passed to people genetically, and so they were severely discriminated against. Some are denied work opportunities and employment. Others are denied public services such as trams, bus rides, and shared bathhouses. Others are discouraged from getting married, fearing that the consequences of radiation sickness can be passed genetically through the family. Intolerant and progressive Fallout factions, civil ghouls that demonstrate rationality and good behaviors are accepted as citizens with equal rights, but less tolerant societies shun them away. Because ghouls cannot reproduce, there will always be a minority group among the human population and are susceptible to the prejudice of man. Ostracized ghouls either wander the wasteland vulnerable and exposed, or join sanctuary ghoul cities, such as the underworld or the sewers of the necropolis, to live on as outcasts. Some factions saw ghouls and supermutants as walking abominations that had no place in post-war America. No faction condemned them more than the Enclave, the oldest faction in the Fallout world. The Enclave were made up of people who were the direct descendants of the US government and other high-ranking military personnel, including the president himself. They were responsible for building the Fallout shelters, the resource walls, the power armor, the forced evolutionary virus, and predicted that China would retaliate with a nuclear strike should their invasion of the mainland was successful. America's primary goal was wiping communism off the face of the earth to leave behind American supremacy, and in a way they were successful, purging the Red Menace from China and Russia in the resulting Great War, while America would survive and live on. Pre-selected Americans were safe in the vaults that the US government had built. Other high-ranking individuals retreated into similar government bunkers, and the most important officials would evacuate to an offshore oil rig, which was miles away from America's mainland, where they continued on with governmental affairs on behalf of their citizens. Being the only faction that existed before and after the Great War, they had a deep understanding of world history that others lacked. They also had access to military pre-war technology, such as power armor and direct energy weapons. The most advanced technology at their disposal was the fleet of vertibirds that they used for transport and military raids. These vertibirds were the world's last means of rotorcraft transport, giving the Enclave a strong advantage in military campaigns. The Enclave spent most of their time in the oil rig, building up their military forces and working in science labs to gain a technological edge over anyone that might have survived the Great War. Once America's radiation level was lowered to an acceptable level, they scouted America and discovered all sorts of mutated horrors roaming the wasteland, including supermutants and ghouls. The Enclave's vision was to restore America to its former glory, to bring back the exceptional American culture that was predominant before the resource wars and the Cold War, on behalf of all Americans who survived the Great War. The Enclave didn't see a place for super mutants, ghouls, and other mutations of the wasteland in this restored America, and so they actively created a plan to kill them all globally. The scientists in the Enclave would end up modifying the forced evolutionary virus into an effective toxin that would target and kill anyone who had been mutated by the forced evolutionary virus. This virus was no longer contained to vats, but had evolved to become airborne and infected every living organism in the wasteland, including humans, though earlier mutations were subtle and hardly noticeable. To the Enclave, the only true Americans that was worthy of preservation was the people who were not exposed to the radiation or the virus. This means that only the people who were connected to the Enclave, as well as the vault dwellers who were still isolated in the shelters, were pure enough to partake in democracy and live on in New America, while the others would die out and fade away. In Fallout 2, a conversation with the President Dick Richardson revealed that he didn't enjoy carrying out this genocide, but he didn't see any other way of restoring America to how it was. He was comforted to know that future generations would probably think of him as an American hero who was able to make the tough decisions. The Enclave's goal was similar to the Masters, that they both wanted to unify the wasteland through genocide and eventual replacement. While the Masters saw humans as inherently divided beings that will always cause conflicts until the unity, the Enclave saw mutants as abominations that had no right to exist in a united American country. These mutations also reflected the failures of American government, as it was through the Resource War, the Great War, and the forced evolutionary virus that created these horrors to begin with. Because the Enclave toxin also targeted humans that were already exposed to the airborne forced evolutionary virus, which included farmers, traders, and raiders, the Enclave were not sanctioned by anyone, and were considered enemies by most factions. If the Enclave redesigned the toxin to only only eradicate the super mutants, the ghouls, and the dangerous mutated animals, whilst leaving the rest of humanity alone, then the Enclave would probably be welcomed and supported by most people of the wasteland, as ghouls and super mutants were already heavily persecuted. But there probably wasn't a way for the Enclave to redesign the toxin to only target a specific strand of mutation without targeting them all. So while the marginalized deaths caused by the toxin would have been regrettable, they were considered acceptable losses if it meant restoring America to how it was. The Enclave and their toxin plan was defeated by the actions of the Chosen One in Fallout 2, as well as the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 3. Similar to the Enclave, the Brotherhood of Steel faction had roots in the pre-war era, being involved with the US military during the Resource Wars. They were assigned to provide security to West Tech while they were developing the forced evolutionary virus. But after they found out about West Tech's unethical medical practices, they mutinied against the corporation and disbanded from the government. The Brotherhood of Steel's military training and access to pre-war weaponry gave them a clear advantage amongst the post-war world, where tribal raiders were poorly equipped and scavengers were struggling to get by. Discouraged by the events of the Great War as well as West Tech's unethical practices, the Brotherhood's core belief was that all advanced technology was to be kept away from lesser people, considering themselves to be the only group worthy enough to handle advanced technology, as others were too irresponsible and unpredictable to be trusted. Most of the missions were focused on holding as much pre-war technology they can get their hands on. They rarely reached out to the other inhabitants of the wasteland, unless it was to raid them for technology they didn't want them to have. They were hypocritically disinterested in collecting technology that could benefit humanity, such as autodocs or medical devices, and only hoarded technology that held a military function. Because of this, most people disliked or distrust the Brotherhood, some even labeling them as terrorists or zealots, as they were secretive, dangerous, and militarized. Their ideas and laws were enshrined in a series of texts called the Codex, which acted as their constitution and established their governing principles. Because of the Codex, the Brotherhood are forbidden to adopt progressive policies that go against their core doctrine. Changing their beliefs was not an option for the Brotherhood, as they are expected to stick with their old ways in the face of all challenges. Any Brotherhood group that altered their traditions, such as the East Coast Brotherhood, are not formally recognized by the High Elders and are treated as outcasts. The Brotherhood lacked vision and direction, and hoarded technology for no great purpose or reason. Lesser scribes and people outside of the Brotherhood could never understand why they were so militant about technology, particularly because other factions were able to get their hands on advanced technology regardless of the Brotherhood's actions. Other factions that had advanced technology often shared it with others, creating new friends and allies, while the Brotherhood were not interested in using the knowledge they had to improve the wasteland or other people's lives, and only made enemies. While outside trading communities grew to become formidable nation-states with large bustling populations, the Brotherhood was stuck underground in the metal bunkers with the numbers shrinking, becoming an obscure, irrelevant circle. While they were strong enough to destroy the Enclave and super mutant threats in their prime, the lack of friends and dwindling numbers made them vulnerable to more expansive factions, such as the NCR. The NCR, or the New California Republic, is the largest and most expansive nation-state in the Fallout series. They resemble the modern state of Western societies, claiming to support democracy, personal liberties, and the rule of law. It was founded in the urban city of Shady Sands by its leader Ardesh and later led by his daughter Tandy, becoming the first presidents of the NCR. Both Ardesh and Tandy created the Republic to consolidate the surrounding trading towns together and bring peace and stability to the region, which was constantly preyed on by raiders and bandits. By uniting these urban centers together and establishing secure trade routes bound in common law, the NCR became a paragon of success. He provided economic stability to the region, a good degree of security to its citizens, raised the standards of living, and promoted the values of virtue and moral ethics among the wasteland. Tandy was beloved by all of the citizens in the NCR, and was continually voted in by the popular vote throughout her lifetime. Because of her achievements and the framework she provided for the NCR, Tandy is regarded as the most influential person in the entire post-war world. But after Tandy's death, the NCR would slowly begin to decline. Tandy's compassionate direction and leadership as president was rare and irreplaceable. Joanna Tibbett would become Tandy's replacement by popular vote, but only lasted for 5 years before 38 NCR citizens were murdered by raiders under her watch. She was replaced by Wendell Peterson, who served for 20 years, and was later succeeded by Aaron Kimball, the current commander-in-chief of the NCR as a fallout in New Vegas. In contrast with the beloved Tandy, Kimball was considered a warhawk, believing the NCR should aggressively expand out to bring new territories under its control. While the old NCR claimed to represent democracy, liberties, and the rule of law, the new NCR supported them only as far as they could exploit others. The NCR bureaucracy had grown to become imperialist, corrupt in nature, greedy, and were in constant wars with other factions. They invented new laws to justify new crimes, using their own bureaucratic process to protect themselves from public scrutiny. They are known to bully weaker settlements and incorporate them into the NCR against their wishes. Once they expand and establish control over these new districts, they force new taxes on those people and use those taxes to continually expand into other areas. The NCR would also impose road tolls in those new districts, burdening NCR citizens with more taxes across popular caravan trade routes, without guaranteeing the safety of its citizens from raiders in return. For independent settlements that are recently put under NCR control, it's obvious to them that the NCR are no more moral or respectful to them or their property than the raiders that raid them. The towns in the frontier openly detest and object to NCR occupation, but are unable to resist them in any meaningful way. Honest citizens of the NCR recognize the corruption of their nation-state, and that they have been in a noticeable decline for years. Most faulted it on the bureaucracy, that it was through governmental policies that made the NCR expand too aggressively and rapidly, which was out of the control of the citizens who were compelled to follow orders. The NCR expanded so fast that they couldn't protect areas that they already controlled. Towns and trade routes within NCR territories were commonly targeted by raiders and bandits, and so citizens never felt safe within the NCR. The NCR ignored those claims and continued to expand out, putting their citizens in danger while demanding more taxes from them. Marcus, an elder supermutant and mayor of Jacobstown, remarked that if the NCR continues to roll over their own people, there eventually will be an armed revolution against its leaders in open revolt. The followers of the Apocalypse faction resembles one of the few altruistic and selfless factions in the Fallout series. They are a secular humanist organization that promoted the free exchange of ideas and technology to help rebuild the wasteland. They were a decentralized group with a limited hierarchy that didn't have a formal structure. Anyone could join their ranks to become a member. Their purpose was to help the inhabitants of the wasteland who were in need, and ensure that the horrors of the Great War was never to be repeated. They did this by providing medical care, agricultural instructions, and technical knowledge to any faction who needed it. They were mostly made up of scientists, doctors, humanitarians, and teachers who were not interested in power or controlling territories, but instead were focused on the welfare of others. Being Fallout's few humanitarian factions, they are usually the ones that clean up after the battles of the wasteland. Although they are against violence, they are capable of defending themselves through personal weaponry and hired mercenaries. This faction resembles one of the most virtuous, rational, and beloved groups of the Fallout series, and are openly welcomed within the territories of most factions. Even the most barbaric tribes are hesitant to attack any of the followers because of the value they provide to them and to others. The followers openly detest factions who are needlessly violent and practice unethical behaviors. The denouncing the expansionist policies of the NCR and the slavery policies of Caesar's Legion, and refused to associate with anyone who are overly authoritative. The followers earned their resources through scavenging, trading, and receiving donations through their specialized knowledge. Because they are not focused on economic production, they are always seen to be in a short supply of equipment and lack the resources they need to sufficiently help the wasteland. As scavengers and raiders continually pick clean the supplies they depend on, the followers face the challenge of not having enough resources to meet their growing needs, and will continue to struggle economically until reliable manufacturing begins in the wasteland. Hardened survivors of the wasteland think that the followers' motivations are naive, that their humanitarian ideals held no place in a dangerous post-war world. This was especially echoed by orphan boy Edward Solo. Solo was frustrated that the followers would spend their limited time and resources helping the backward tribes of the wasteland, instead of using their talents for more productive endeavors. After he was captured by one of these backward tribes during an expedition, a series of events would make him separate from the followers, to eventually lead the largest slave army in the wasteland, Caesar's Legion. Caesar's Legion resembles Fallout's most terrifying and brutal factions, capable of enslaving the NCR, as well as every other faction in the wasteland. They represent a vast army of conquered slaves that engaged in total war conflicts against other tribes. Edward Solo shortly started the Legion after he was captured by the Blackfoot tribe. Instead of allowing himself to be sold for ransom, he helped Blackfoot defeat their neighboring enemies. Using the knowledge he had learnt from books in the Followers of the Apocalypse libraries, he would help the Blackfoot tribe be victorious through guerrilla warfare, pre-war weaponry, and small unit tactics. Once victorious, Solo would give the conquered tribes the limited choice of either joining him or be executed. Through continued conquests of smaller tribes and enslaving their members, he was able to amass the greatest tribal army of the wasteland. The Legion attacks settlements and factions they can overwhelm, claiming all their property, enslaving their women, and executing captors who refuse to assimilate into the Legion. They are a totalitarian society, with all property rights and commands issued by Edward Solo himself, who took the name Caesar after modeling his society off of the ancient Roman Empire. While the Roman Empire was familiar by most people of the pre-war world, it was foreign and alien to the tribes of the post-war world. Whenever Solo conquered a new tribe, he would strip down the cultural elements of that group and replaced it with the dominant cultural identity of the Legion, which was heavily inspired by the Roman Empire. By removing the cultural differences that conflicted each tribe, he reconditioned each individual to serve under a single banner, creating a strong nation-state that was based on cultural homogeneity. The individualistic quality of the self was broken down in the Legion, as all individuals held no value other than their utility to the state. Solo believed that being a slave in the Legion was preferable than allowing them to live in their backwards way, and that he was elevating the tribal people that he conquered when they became a part of the Legion. While Solo modeled some of the cultural and aesthetic aspects of the Roman Empire, he would also incorporate other pragmatic values outside of it to help the cause of the Legion. Unlike the Roman Empire, tradition, family, and religious freedoms were not revered in the Legion. Traditional family structures and monogamous marriages did not benefit the Legion, and was discouraged by Solo. Men were instructed to enslave the females of conquered tribes and impregnate them to replace the military men lost in battle. Their children would be taken away from their mothers once of age and would become indoctrinated into the values of the Legion, producing legionnaires that were far more loyal than the tribesmen that were converted. Women in the Legion are seen as less than men and are expected to fulfill the roles of caregivers, midwives, and breeders. This was not because of sexist prejudices, but rather to serve the Legion in the most optimal way as dictated by Caesar. In the Roman Empire, women were allowed more rights than the women in the Legion. They had the right to property, the right to autonomy, and the right to choose their husbands. Polygamous marriages were forbidden in ancient Rome, and adultery was also considered an immoral and criminal act, leading to strong traditional family values in the empire. Caesar's treatment of family and children more closely resembles Islam in this regard, in that Muslim men had the right to own slave women seized during military campaigns against against the infidel, and was considered moral to do so. The children born from these molestations were automatically considered Muslim under Islamic law, and were instructed in Islamic customs at a young age, much like Caesar's legion. The barbaric treatment of women within Caesar's legion created strong animosity amongst other factions. It was particularly detested within the NCR, as females in the NCR are considered equal to men and enjoyed equal rights. They served in the military, could earn promotions, and could even become presidents through popular vote. When NCR women are captured by the Legion, they are removed of those liberties to become subjects of the Legion, expected to breed with whatever tribal that raped her. Some NCR females that are captured by the Legion are killed by other NCR rangers in mercy killings, to save them from the horrors of being sex slaves to the Legion. Edward Solo also emulated Julius Caesar when he titled himself the Son of God. The imperial cult of ancient Rome identified emperors such as Caesar and Augustus as divine entities, which was done to strengthen their authority and to gather the respect of people who value religion and tradition. Solo decreed that he was the son of Mars, that his people were the chosen people, that the atomic bombs were sent by his father to cleanse the world with fire, and that everything he said was dictated by Mars himself. Obeying Caesar was to obey the will of Mars. Those who claimed otherwise were blasphemers, condemning oneself to death. People within the Legion believed that they were the only righteous people of the wasteland, whose duty was to deliver the wasteland from chaos and barbarianism. They belittled anyone outside of the Legion with derogative labels, such as degenerates, dissolutes, and profligates, which reaffirms the moral legitimacy and superiority. Because they dehumanized their enemies, it was considered a moral right to subjugate their lessers, demanding servitude from everyone who was beneath them. Solo believed that human reliance on technology weakened humanity, and that it was through this reliance that made the Great War possible. The Legion promoted individual fitness and martial excellence to reduce the need for technology, and to make the Legion more reliant on the leadership of Solo. Because of the militarized and tribal aspect of Caesar's Legion, there is very little economic production from within the faction. They relied on pillaging and conquering for resources, which made them economically on par with raiders. The Legion faced similar problems that the Scavengers faced, such as not finding the right items for their needs, as well as not having manufacturing capabilities within their tribes, so they relied on traders to fill the gaps. Traders were welcomed in the Legion's territory, guaranteeing safe passage and honest bartering relations. The Legion also placed very little taxes on their subjects, and did not establish roll tolls within their territories like the NCR did. The raiders that terrorized the citizens of the NCR were nowhere to be found in the Legion's territory, as they were either incorporated into the Legion or were crucified. The raiders were intimidated by the brutality of Caesar's Legion, and so they dispersed into NCR territories to prey on weaker individuals. Traders, slaves, and other subjects of the Legion were completely safe against raiders in Caesar-controlled areas, unlike most other places of the wasteland. Caravans did not have to hire mercenaries for security when they traveled, as being branded with the Legion's mark was enough to guarantee safety. Most NCR citizens were envious of the Legion's effectiveness when it came to raiders, with some even acknowledging that the results of Caesar's fascism to be superior than the weaker approach taken by the NCR. Caesar's main goal in Fallout New Vegas was to conquer the dominant NCR force in the Mojave and annex their territories, including the Hoover Dam and the Vegas Strip. Doing so would transform the Legion from a nomadic slave army into a genuine respected empire with a capital city. Solo saw democracy as weak, ineffective, and corrupt. He states that the NCR was the most stable and effective during its early years of Ardesh and Tandy rule. Although they efficiently represented democracy, the family and their bloodline was continually voted in by popular vote. The long leadership more closely resembled a hereditary monarchy than an actual representative democracy. democracy. Once the hereditary line died, so did the values of the NCR. It was then that the corruptive nature of democracy started to manifest within the system. Greed became the governing principle of the NCR, with self-interested politicians taking bribes from Brahmin barons and wealthy landowners, which was done to the detriment of its citizens and the greater good. Sulla recognized that the same problems that existed within the NCR also existed within the early Roman Republic, that the constant infighting, extreme bureaucracy, and rapid corruption in the Senate that corrupted the Republic was also deteriorating the NCR. And just as the Roman Republic was conquered by a strong military force to transform it into a military dictatorship, it was only natural that the NCR should also be conquered by a strong military force, so it can also be transformed into a military dictatorship just as Julius Caesar did to the Roman Republic. Sulla used the philosophical theory of Hegelian dialectic to help design this goal. Dialectics, originating with Socrates, is the process of establishing truth through reasoned arguments. Using this methodology, people can examine conflicting philosophical principles through continual dialogue to help establish truth. Hegelian dialectics expands on this and establishes 3 stages of examining truth: a thesis, or a problem, the antithesis, which is a reaction to that problem, and a synthesis, which is whatever is left over, and thus the solution of that problem. This synthesis is supposed to remove the flaws of both the problem and the reaction, to leave behind a solution which is superior to both, while still holding common elements of the two. Sulla saw human history as a series of events, in which each event had a problem and a reaction. Whatever was left behind was the stronger solution. When addressed with the problem of the NCR, Sulla saw its reaction as a stronger military force that could conquer it and transform it into something new. He envisioned that the synthesis would change both the NCR and the Legion into a military empire that protected its citizens and the power of its dictator. That just as Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his army to end the Roman Republic and bring imperialism to Rome, so will Sulla cross the Hoover Dam with his army to end the NCR Republic and bring imperialism to the wasteland. But both the Legion and the NCR do not account for the business magnate and the technological genius that is Robert House. Robert Edward House is introduced in New Vegas. He is described as an entrepreneur, a technical genius, and a business magnate. He was modeled after the business tycoon Howard Hughes, known as the wealthiest self-made person of his time, who lived in penthouses of hotels in various cities such as Las Vegas, and became reclusive and enigmatic in his later years. Robert House was the founder of Rubco Industries, responsible for the Pip-Boy, the Protectrons, and a unified operating system that is run on most terminals. Due to the success of these projects, he was a billionaire by the time he was 30. Mr. House also understood the nature of governments, politics, and war. He was born during the Cold War, lived through the resource wars, had connections to the military, and predicted the events of nuclear war. He used his money and his technical knowledge to set up a defensive laser system in his Las Vegas hotel to shoot down any nuclear weapons that might have come through, as well as transmitting disarm codes to warheads in transit. He was successful in doing so, nullifying most of the atomic bombs in the atmosphere and protecting Las Vegas from the destruction of the Great War. Mr. House then united the tribal clans around the area and rebuilt the Las Vegas Strip into New Vegas, a tourist attraction filled with casinos, resorts, lights, and entertainment. Perhaps the only one of its kind in the New World. New Vegas attracted many customers, earning riches through his tourism ventures. He was able to defend his property from raiders and other troublemakers through his personal army of Securitrons, which are resistant to shrapnel and small arms fire. His goal was to use the capital he earned through his business ventures to rebuild the production capabilities of humanity. He claimed that he could reignite the technological development sectors within 20 years, which means he'll expand agriculture communities, create industries using steam or nuclear power, and bring the atomic age back to the wasteland within 2 decades. These goals are achievable for Mr. House. considering his past career successes, his technical knowledge, and the capital he earns through New Vegas. He may be the only person alive who is capable of doing so. The plot of New Vegas was based on the challenges Mr. House faced when the NCR and the Legion conspired to annex his estates. While factions such as the NCR and the Legion resembles functional societies, Mr. House rejected them as regurgitations of the past. He predicts that both factions will inevitably collapse into themselves because they repeat the same political and economic mistakes of history. Mr. House thought that the NCR carries over the same pre-war flaws of democracy, and held no respect for its corrupt bureaucracy. He also thought that the Legion held no long-term prospects, and that it could not survive without Caesar's brutality. Once Caesar was out of the picture, either through natural causes or through his many enemies, the Legion would be doomed to fall within a year, consuming on itself through constant internal infighting. Mr. House tells the player that he is not interested in abusing others or issuing laws that dictates what people can or can't do in their private time. He resembles a man who is principled, rational, and honest. He describes the relationship with the player as well as the tribal clans as one based on contracts and employment, rather than violence or legislation. He rejects authoritative governments and the democracies that enables them, which he blames for the Great War, and prefers the freedom to direct his own economic resources and capital investments himself, which is what the NCR and the Legion threaten to take away from him. If Mr. House had the economic freedom to rebuild industries, it would allow other factions, such as the followers of the Apocalypse, to benefit from a more productive and resource-rich economic world. A world where people didn't have to rely on scavenging to get by, but where items were produced and manufactured on a mass scale. This would allow people who are dependent on scavenging new opportunities, as well as reducing the incentive for bandits to raid others. This reality is not something the NCR or the Legion are interested in achieving, as they don't have the technological or economic means to do so, and prefer to forcefully take other people's property for their own ends. If the player helps Mr. House achieve independence, Mr. House will punish people who had previously aligned themselves to his enemies, including the Legion and the expansive NCR. He physically removes one of his neighboring factions, the Kings, if they aligned themselves with the NCR in your playthrough. He also imposes heavy taxes on the citizens of Prim if they conspire to help the NCR annex his estates. No other abuses from him are recorded in the game, which means Mr. House is probably true to his word. Mr. House is the preferred faction I align with in my playthroughs, as he represents liberty, progress, competence, and a bright future for humanity, while the other factions do not. While the independent ending of Vegas also brings freedom and liberty to New Vegas, Mr. House is the only person who has the intelligence, the economic means, the determination, and the longevity that can provide the wasteland the long-term solutions that it desperately needs, which is something the Curia, the NCR, and the Legion could never achieve. The Institute and the Railroad are new factions that were introduced in Fallout 4 that are based around the themes of artificial intelligence. The Institute is an advanced scientific organization that produced intelligent humanoid robots to help them perform manual tasks such as scavenging. These robots, called synths, are sentient and indistinguishable from humans. Contrary to this, the Railroad is an underground organization that had the primary aim of freeing those same synths, which is loosely based on the Underground Railroad of America. The moral ambiguity between the two reflects on the theme of artificial intelligence. And at what point do machines earn the same rights as humans? In Fallout, the third generation of synths had the same biological makeup as humans. The only difference between a synth and a human is the neurological implant found inside their brains, which allowed them to be programmed. The Institute regarded these synths as nothing more than machines that were designed to be slaves, while the Railroad believed that these synths were deserving of human rights and needed to be freed from the Institute. When the player joins the railroad, they are asked if they would risk their lives for a synth as they would a human, to test their commitment to the cause. Other than the biological makeup of the Generation 3 synths, their sentience, intelligence, and personalities are not that different from other advanced artificial intelligence that are found in Fallout. Codsworth reveals that he is depressed about the state of the world after the Great War, demonstrating that he has the ability to learn, express emotion, and feel empathy. These personalities are also reflected in Victor and Jane. If the railroad demands that their members risk their lives for a synth, it follows that they must also risk their lives for artificial intelligence of similar cognition, such as Victor or Jane. If not, then they are not actually trying to help preserve the artificial intelligence of these machines, but rather feel emotionally conflicted that these machines look like humans and that they were built to be slaves. If this was the case, then the Institute could avoid future conflicts with the railroad by making their Generation 3 synths look inhuman and more robotic. If synths were redesigned to look different to humans, it would be harder for the railroad to feel empathy towards machines that were obviously not like them. Codsworth or Victor are not remarkable enough for the railroad to risk their lives for, and if all synths were manufactured to make that reality more evident, it would be doubtful that the railroad would even care about them. But once their synths no longer passed for human, they would receive greater attention from other factions, such as the Brotherhood of Steel and the Minutemen. The Minutemen was introduced as a new faction in Fallout 4 and were based on the private colonists of the American Revolutionary War. They were a well-prepared militia who responded quickly to war threats from Indians and the French, hence the name Minutemen. In American history, the Minutemen were one of the first groups that fought in the American Revolutionary War. English colonies started the revolution when they were forced to pay taxes for Great Britain without having any representation in Parliament, something that was illegal under Britain's Bill of Rights. No taxation without representation became the slogan of the American Revolution, after colonists were denied that right as Englishmen. With the help of the French, the Minutemen and other colonist groups pushed back English rule from America and claimed America's independence as a sovereign state, which is celebrated as Independence Day. The Founding Fathers created America's own Bill of Rights called the Constitution, the supreme law of the land, designed to protect individual liberties and restrict the powers of government. These individual liberties that were promised in the Constitution, such as the freedom of speech and the freedom to bear arms, have been restricted since then, and the limited powers of government has expanded into areas outside of the Founding Fathers' vision, including farming, money, banking, health, nuclear energy, technology, taxes, roads, charities, education, tourism, and the digital industry. In the Fallout universe, the US government continues to expand with the Resource Wars, the Sino-American War, the Great War, and finally the Enclave, which was eventually defeated by the Brotherhood of Steel and the NCR. Ironically, because the US government became too tyrannical, the NCR has its own similar constitution, as does the Brotherhood of Steel, in the form of the Codex. The NCR's constitution does little to help its citizens when the government chooses to expand and become tyrannical. They either ignore their constitution or amend it when they want to expand their power, which is also done in the US government. Comparably, the rigidness of the Brotherhood's Codex made their faction permanently stuck in their old ways. They were stagnant against the constant evolving dangers of the wasteland, which made them a vulnerable and irrelevant group. Both the NCR and the Brotherhood of Steel were outmatched by Caesar's Legion, who had no Bill of Rights nor a constitution. All of their power was concentrated in the hands of Caesar himself, where he commanded his legion to overcome whatever challenges that they faced. But no matter the faction, no matter the town, no matter the brutality, all societies in Fallout uphold the same two universal principles within them. The same two universal principles that is reflected within all cultures, in all communities, in all countries, in all time. Don't steal and don't start trouble. Something as simple as that doesn't need a constitution nor a codex to uphold it. Yet, no bureaucracy or government could ever follow it. Not the NCR, not the Caesar's Legion, not the Enclave, not the Communist powers, and not the US government. The only two factions that didn't steal or create trouble was the followers of the Apocalypse and Mr. House. The only two moral and productive forces in the wasteland, amidst a horde of raiders, slavers, and takers. In this dialectic, the problems of our history and of fallouts are obvious. The antithesis is applying the same two universal principles that we already accept. Don't steal and don't start trouble into the thesis. The resulting synthesis will remove the problems of the thesis to leave behind the solution. A solution that is so obvious and simple and yet difficult to grasp and imagine. A solution that would have avoided the great horrors of our world and the horrors of Fallout's world, and a solution that would promise a future for our children that no government could ever provide. And now, our dialectic is over. The Fallout series combines various historical cultures of Earth into one semi-realistic setting. It teaches us that World War IV will not be fought with sticks and stones. It will be fought with whatever weapons people can scavenge from the pre-war world. Fallout's greatest lesson is that even after the horrors of the Cold War, the Resource Wars, the Great War, and the attempted genocide of groups, the factions of Fallout still repeat the same mistakes of Earth's history. While they can make the excuse that they were born in ignorance from the vaults, we cannot do the same, not while we have the internet and live in the digital age. The complete destruction of the Earth was not enough to change the path of humanity in Fallout, and considering our continual wars, the rise and fall of empires, and the continued clashes between cultures, it won't be enough for us either. We are doomed to repeat history's mistakes over and over again until we stop it, and it is in our power to stop it. War. War will never change, but we can.
You will now answer to the charge of being a grievously savage race.
Grievously savage could mean anything. I will answer only specific charges.
Are you certain you want a full disclosure of human ugliness? So be it, fool. Present the charges!
That nonsense is centuries behind us.
But you can't deny that you're still a dangerous, savage child race.
Most certainly I deny it. I agree we still were when humans wore costumes like that 400 years ago.
Which time you slaughtered millions in silly arguments about how to divide the resources of your little world. And 400 years before that, you were murdering each other in quarrels over tribal god images. Since then, there are no indications that humans will ever change.
But even when we wore costumes like that, we'd already started to make rapid progress.
Oh yeah? You want to review your rapid progress?
The first duty of every Starfleet officer is to the truth, whether it's scientific truth, or historical truth, or personal truth. It is the guiding principle on which Starfleet is based. Now, if you can't find it within yourself to stand up and tell the truth about what happened, you don't deserve to wear that uniform. I'm going to make this simple for you, Mr. Crusher. Either you come forward and tell Admiral Brand what really took place, or
by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream.
17 times, as events have heightened or lessened the possibility of a nuclear war.
There is a tomorrow. It's not all going to be over with a big flash and a bomb. That the human race is improving. That we have things to be proud of. So in those days, when you couldn't get even blacks on television, that I not only had a black, but a black woman and a black officer. We treated such things as mixed races aboard the spaceship, and whether women could be in charge of anything and so on. And when we shocked the audience by saying yes to those questions. Great affection I have for Asians and what they do and the important part they play in the world, and I just could not have a group of Earth people without including that. It's not all over. It's not we're not going to go up in smoke. We're going to make it. Because it says the human adventure has just begun. That's it in a nutshell.
Live long and prosper. Image of Serac, father of all we now hold true.
All your people must learn before you can reach for the star.
First time any man's freedom is trodden on, we're all damaged.
On Earth, there is no poverty, no crime, no war.
One voice can be stronger than 1,000 voices.
Never spend more for an acquisition than you have to.
So much the better. All that mattered was Cardassia. I loved my homeland. That's what justified my actions.
What I have done was for the Empire.
Nobody leaves paradise. Everyone should want to be in the Federation. Hell, you even want the Cardassians to join.
It's the Klingons. They're nothing compared to what's waiting.
I am a Jem'Hadar. It is the order of things.
I obey the Founders in all things.
The Salads have always been a threat to us. That's the only justification we need.
There is no we. There is only us. One mind,